All right, so we're going to be finishing up Daniel chapter 11 this week. So Daniel chapter 11 is a really challenging chapter to interpret because, number one, it has really intricate details, but at the same time it has symbolic language mixed in there as well. And it provides this really powerful reminder of God's sovereignty over history and his faithfulness to his people. And we saw that a lot last week with what we went over with, thank you, sorry. That was my fault. I think I had them off the whole time. So when I would practice music, I would shut all the lights off except for the stage lights, and I couldn't see anything, and it was just a time. So I did that for her, and I just completely forgot about it. All right. So we talked a little bit last week about how this chapter contains one of the most specifically fulfilled prophecies in the entire Bible. And it accurately predicts history over a span of 375 years. And we talked about before that people think the accuracy of this book makes it impossible for Daniel to have predicted it, that it's too accurate. There's no way that he would have been able to predict that. An angel didn't talk to him. It was written after the fact. That's what they say. It's so specific that critics insist that it was written after these events actually happened in history, and then somebody went back and wrote this book and made it look like it was prophecy. But for those that actually believe in the amazing supernatural nature of our God and that this is divinely inspired word and that an angel did speak to Daniel, this is a testament to God knowing all things and God being able to actually do the miraculous. This is an amazing book here. And last week was all historical content. We went over all this history last week. We read through the prophecy that was in the scripture all the way through the first 20 verses and how that prophecy was actually fulfilled by actual historical events that we could look back on. Now, from Daniel's perspective, it was the future. From our perspective, it was the past. So we can actually, validify. We can validify it. Validate. This week we're going to go over some more history, but then you're going to see there's a shift in focus towards the end of this chapter from historical events to end-time prophecies, which is what everybody wants to get into, and that's what's exciting. So Daniel chapter 11, from verses 1 to 35, it meticulously outlines all of these historical conflicts between the Ptolemaic kings of the south and the Seleucid kings of the north. And we're going to hear a lot about this guy that we've talked about a few times before, this Antiochus Epiphanes guy. We're going to talk about him for almost the entire chapter today. But what's amazing is this chapter is so detailed and so accurate is that, like I said, people believe it was written hundreds of years later than it actually was. So let's jump right into it this evening, the second half of Daniel chapter 11, beginning with verse 21. Daniel 11:21 says, "And in his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the majesty of kingship has not been conferred. But he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue." So that first part, it says, "In his place of a despicable person will arise." So just basic on face value or whatever of this verse, whoever's going to succeed whoever this is going to succeed the previous ruler, is basically what it's saying. But this new ruler is going to be despicable. And the word there for despicable means to despise, to hold in contempt, to disdain. So naturally, this whoever this is, this highlights their negative character. I put this highlights whoever this is negative character. A lot of poor English in here. But it says the majesty of kingship has not been conferred. In other words, he's not going to come to power by any kind of legitimate means or by rightful succession. That's not how he's going to come to power. But it says that he's going to come in a time of tranquility and he'll seize the kingdom by intrigue, which is interesting to think about. But in other words, he's going to seize power by using things like deception and be really cunning. And he's going to be manipulative, and he's going to use political intrigue instead of using the natural means of seizing power. So this verse is widely understood to be talking about our buddy Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a Seleucid king. He gained power by being really clever and by being really manipulative, instead of being the rightful heir. He was an oppressive guy, and he was really oppressive against the Jewish people, and we're going to get into that later today. But as we've talked about before, he desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, and he was cruel, and he was this tyrannical leader. And that part of the verse says that he would seize the kingdom by intrigue is actually a really accurate description of him. The word for intrigue there means to be really smooth. The definition was very smooth, a treacherous spot and blandishment. Antiochus, he used political maneuvering and manipulation and deception to gain power. So this verse is setting the stage, essentially, for the rest of Daniel chapter 11. And that's why we left off on verse 20 last week, because for the rest of this chapter, we're going to keep seeing Antiochus. It's Antiochus the Fourth. But Antiochus's actions and the impact of his actions throughout the rest of this chapter. Verses 22 and 23 says, "The overflowing forces will be flooded away from him and smashed, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people." So this verse, so basically the way I'm going to kind of frame this is we're going to look at the verse kind of matter of fact, and then we're going to look at the historical significance of it. So this is saying that Antiochus is going to overcome his opposition, both from a military and political perspective. The first part says, overflowing forces will be flooded away from him and smashed. It's pretty obviously talking about military successes that he's going to have and his ability to crush his enemies. It's a powerful leader. But it says also the prince of the covenant, too. So this is widely interpreted to be referring to the high priest, Ananias III. And he was this high priest that was actually overthrown and murdered during Antiochus Epiphanes' reign. And this high priest was actually looked at as the legitimate leader of the Jewish people at the time, which is why this verse refers to him as the Prince of the Covenant. And then verse 23 there, talking about the alliance and the deception and the gaining power with this small force of people, it's talking about Antiochus's treachery and his ability to gain power through deception, through manipulating people. He was very cunning. And it shows that even when he makes agreements, he doesn't keep his word. And he uses those agreements for his own gain, his own political gain. And we're going to see that even more in this chapter. There's going to be specific verses about that, about agreements and things like that too. But even with all of that, he's still going to have his supporters. There's still people that seem to gravitate towards these kind of people. So it's true that he will initially gain support from a small group of people. And the small group, according to what we've figured out, is the Hellenistic Jews, because they wanted to follow Greek customs. So you can already see how accurately just these first few verses here already reflect Antiochus's actions and the way he was. Because he did actually use treaties and alliances as tools to advance his own agenda. He was a very manipulative guy. But at the same time, he didn't have any kind of problem breaking those alliances and those treaties when it suited his own purposes. He was a very self-serving guy. And again, that's going to come up more than once. Verse 24, it says, in a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers did not, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, spoils, and possessions among them, and he will devise schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. So it says he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and it's talking about Antiochus's expansion of his power, is him going into these other places. But it says that he will accomplish what his fathers did not, nor his ancestors. So what that is kind of alluding to is this kind of unprecedented nature of his actions. He didn't act the way that people would normally act. In other words, he would use tactics that were bold and maybe a little risky, but unusual. He would use things that weren't normal in terms of the way people ran stuff back then. And it says he's going to distribute plunder, spoils, and possessions among them. And what he would actually do is he would distribute wealth and resources to his supporters. He was essentially buying their loyalty. He was spoiling them to get their loyalty. And it says that he will devise schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. In other words, he's going to make strategic plans to attack fortified places, making schemes against strongholds. But his success is going to be limited in that. Once again, this verse accurately predicts and reflects Antiochus IV, because he was known for his ability to gain power through his cunningness, his cleverness, and manipulation, and he tended to avoid direct military confrontation when possible. He would manipulate people first. And then distributing wealth was a key part of his strategy. He would essentially buy people. And it would allow him to build this loyal following and consolidate his power without ever having to take over anything, really, and have to go in and have a military conquest. He would spoil people and buy them. And the part about accomplishing what his fathers and ancestors couldn't is also an accurate statement about Antiochus. He was known for this kind of unusual behavior and kind of going against the grain of what a normal leader would do. He would do things that were unusual for a Seleucid king. And just like last week, very simple, direct verses that just kind of make a statement about some vague figure, it turns out that it very accurately displays history, and we can apply it to direct and actual things. The whole rest of this chapter is pretty mind-blowing on how accurate it is. And very similar to last week, where it's just like, this guy did this, and then you look at the history and you're like, this guy did this. That's what he did. So that's what it's going to be all night. I'll try not to get excited about it. Daniel 11:25-26 says, and he will stir up his wealth and courage against the king of the south with a very large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, because schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. So this is talking about a military confrontation between Antiochus IV and a Ptolemaic king. And in fact, Antiochus IV did launch a large-scale attack, and the Ptolemaic king did respond with a powerful army. But the Ptolemaic king would ultimately fall because of some internal conspiracies and some treachery that he was going through. And the part that says that those who eat his choice food will destroy him is talking about that actual betrayal that was actually recorded in history in this Ptolemaic kingdom. Those that were close to the Ptolemaic king would in fact betray him. And it was most likely his advisors and officials, but this internal betrayal would lead to the collapse of the Ptolemaic army. And guess what? It's fulfilled in history by Antiochus IV's campaigns against Ptolemy VI Philometor. I hope I said that right. Philometor of Egypt. And history tells us that Antiochus did in fact launch multiple invasions against Egypt, and he was able to exploit the internal divisions and weaknesses in the Ptolemaic kingdom. And he exploited those things, and he was victorious because of that. Basically, Antiochus IV would attack Egypt with a large army, and the Egyptian king would also have a really large army, but because of plots against the Egyptian king by those close to him, the betrayal there, Antiochus IV would win, which is exactly what that verse said, and it's exactly how history played out. Verse 27. As for both kings, their hearts would be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table. But it will not succeed, because the end is still to come at the appointed time. So both kings' hearts would be intent on evil, and they'll speak lies to each other at the same table. In other words, both leaders are going to sit down and they're going to pretend to negotiate. But in reality, their hearts were intent on evil. So they were focused on betraying each other. The verse says it's not going to succeed because the time is still to come because the end is still to come at the appointed time. Basically, their deception and planning and plotting against each other would ultimately fail. The end coming at the appointed time is talking about God's plan coming to fruition. So throughout this chapter also, we're going to see how God controls everything. God's got the plan. No matter what these guys think they can do and how powerful they think they are, God's still in control. Doesn't matter how powerful they are. And this verse is talking about actual meetings and negotiations between Antiochus IV and Ptolemy Philometor of Egypt. And despite their outward appearances of diplomacy and negotiation and trying to work together, both rulers were in fact driven by self-interest and a desire to deceive each other in history. But even though they're trying to manipulate the situation and trying to take advantage of each other, just like this verse said, God is still in control. Their plans would not fully succeed because God's plan would ultimately happen. Verse 28 says, "Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land." So first it says he'll return to his own land, or to his land with much plunder. So Antiochus IV would return from this campaign with a bunch of wealth, which was probably acquired by ransacking a bunch of stuff and taking it. And it says his heart will be set against the holy covenant. In other words, he's going to be hostile to the Jewish people and their religious practices. He's going to take action and return to his own land. So he's going to take actions against the Jewish people before returning to his own territory. That's how the verse plays it out. And yet another verse that accurately reflects history, talking about Antiochus IV once again. His actions after his campaigns in Egypt. He was known for being really hostile towards the Jews. He implemented policies that were aimed at suppressing Jewish religious practices. This verse flat out says that his heart will be set against the holy covenant. That's a pretty clear statement. And history tells us that he did, in fact, desecrate the Jewish temple. And he outlawed Jewish religious practices. Now, this verse marks kind of a turning point in the narrative here because it shifts focus from Antiochus IV's political campaigns and military campaigns to his persecution of the Jewish people directly. Verse 29 says, "At the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this time it will not turn out the way it did before." So Antiochus IV is going to launch another campaign against Egypt, but this particular campaign is not going to have the same successful outcome that the last one did. And guess what? History tells us again, talking about Antiochus IV and his second invasion into Egypt. Unlike the previous invasion where he was successful, this one was met with opposition from the Roman Republic. The Roman Senate, who was actually really uncomfortable with Antiochus IV because he was growing in power, they sent this envoy to deliver an ultimatum to him. I feel like I'm not saying ultimatum right. So this envoy was headed up by this guy named Gaius Popilius Laenas. And he was this politician and general that was part of the Roman Republic. And what he did, and there's this story where he goes up to Antiochus IV and he draws a circle around him. And he says that basically you need to make your decision before you leave that circle, is basically what he says. So if you look up the story of it, he had like a cane or a stick with him, and he drew a circle around him, and he said, "Before you step out of that circle, give me a reply to lay before the Senate." And Antiochus replied, "I will do what the Senate thinks right." And then he extended his hand to the king as a friend and an ally. And then Antiochus left Egypt. So faced with the threat of Roman military intervention here, Antiochus says, "Okay, never mind. I'm going to withdraw from Egypt. I don't want to mess with you guys." Which fulfills this verse saying that his campaign was different from his earlier successes. Verse 30 says, "For the ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore he will withdraw in fear and return and then curse the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and pay attention to those who abandon the holy covenant." Now, so the arrival of these Roman ships is what really scared Antiochus and forced him to withdraw from Egypt. So Kittim is kind of a biblical term that's talking about the coastal regions. And in this context, it's referring to Rome. So he's going to withdraw in fear because Rome's more powerful than he is. And your translation, so mine says that he will withdraw in fear. Your translation might say that he will lose heart, that he'll be grieved. But basically, he's going to give up. And then he's going to return and curse the holy covenant and take action. So very similar to that other verse, because of this withdrawal, Antiochus IV is going to be really upset, and he's going to direct his anger towards the Jewish people and their religious practices. So he's going to take out his failed conquest on them. And it says he will come back and pay attention to those who abandoned the Holy Covenant. The word there for pay attention, it means to show favor towards. In other words, he's going to show favor to the people that abandon the Holy Covenant, to the Jews that decide to not be practicing Jews. In other words, he's going to become allies with Jews that abandon their faith and decide that they want to embrace this Hellenistic culture. And guess what? All of this is historically accurate. From the arrival to the Roman ships, to the ultimatum delivered by that Roman general. And there's this stark turning point here. Antiochus turned his focus to the Jewish people. He decided, okay, that's it. I'm not going to go after Egypt anymore. I'm going to go after these guys. And that includes the desecration of the temple and the persecution of the Jews that remained faithful to the Jewish religion, to the Jewish faith. And because the Romans made him leave Egypt, he was really upset. And he took that anger out on the Jewish people. And he found allies with Jewish people that had turned away from the Jewish faith to help him. Verse 31, it says, forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. So forces from him will arise. So Antiochus IV is going to organize military forces to take out his plans, to carry out his plans. And he's going to desecrate the sanctuary fortress, which is desecration of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. He's going to do away with the regular sacrifice, which means he's going to stop all the regular temple rituals and the Jewish worship. And it says that he will set up the abomination of desolation. This is talking about introducing idol worship and essentially making a mockery of the Jewish temple. He's talking about a deliberate act of defilement of the Jewish temple. And again, all of this is historically accurate. He did send forces to Jerusalem. He did have them desecrate the temple. He did stop the daily sacrifices and the religious practices of the Jews. And the abomination of desolation is widely understood to be talking about he built an altar to Zeus Olympius in the temple, which is a pagan god. It was a deliberate act to try to force the Jewish people to abandon their faith and accept the Greek gods, to accept pagan polytheistic religious beliefs. And eventually, this is what led to the Maccabean revolt. The Maccabean revolt is a Jewish rebellion against the Seleucid Empire, fighting for religious freedom and fighting for religious independence, ultimately leading to the reconsecration of the temple in Jerusalem. And that's what is celebrated during Hanukkah. So verse 32, it says, and by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will be strong and take action. So by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. Antiochus IV would use his cunning and clever deception and manipulation to win over those who might be a little more inclined to abandon their faith. And he'll offer them powers or positions of power and influence them and manipulate them. The people who know their God will be strong and take action. So the first part there is talking about people with weak faith, essentially. It says that they would act wickedly toward the covenant. People that would be easily manipulated by Antiochus. But the second part of that verse is a real stark contrast to those people. Talking about those that are faithful to God. That they're strong and they take action. They're going to resist Antiochus's attempts to corrupt them. And it says they'll take action. And those are the people that would form the core of the Maccabean resistance that would fight against the forces of Antiochus IV. Again, a simple verse turning into actual history. Verse 33 says, and those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by the sword and by the flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. So those that have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. In other words, the wise and the faithful are going to provide spiritual guidance and instruction to others. But this verse says they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and plunder for many days. That's talking about the suffering and the persecution that these faithful individuals are going to have to deal with. They're going to have to put up with this persecution, really brutal stuff. And this verse oh my gosh, I can't say this word. This verse accurately reflects the situation during the Maccabean revolt. It's understood that this verse is talking about the leaders and the teachers that actually remained faithful to the Jewish religion, that stood up for all the Jewish tradition, Jewish teaching, and they resisted the Hellenistic culture of Antiochus IV that he was trying to impose on them. And these leaders and these teachers did, in fact, provide spiritual guidance and encouragement to other Jews, which naturally strengthened their cause. But standing up against somebody like Antiochus meant that they're going to face persecution. And this verse says it's going to last for many days. It's going to go on. Verses 34 and 35. It says, when they fall, they'll be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. And some of those who have insight will fall to refine, purge, and cleanse them until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Once again, reminding us that God's in control. But this verse kind of alludes to a glimmer of hope in the beginning. It says, when they fall, they'll be granted a little help. But then it says, many will join them in hypocrisy. So those facing persecution will receive some help. And that phrase, a little help, is a lot of times it's interpreted as referring to the initial and not entirely pure support that came up during the Maccabean revolt, where people kind of wanted to join, but maybe their hearts weren't in it as much as some of the other people. It says, many will join with them in hypocrisy. Now, your translation might say flattery. It might say they'll join with them with flattery. It's talking about them being insincere. When you flatter somebody, you're exaggerating. It's not genuine. And it's talking about them being insincere in terms of them wanting to join with them. So some are going to join this resistance using some deception maybe, or maybe it's just false support. In other words, not everybody supporting the Maccabean revolt had pure motives. Not all of them were faithful Jews that wanted to stand up for their beliefs. It says some of those who have insight will fall. Meaning even some of the most wise and faithful are going to experience some real suffering, and some of them might even experience death. But verse 35 also says to refine, purge, and cleanse them. That's where things start to get cool, because these trials and this persecution actually has a purifying effect, strengthening their faith and strengthening their character. And then verse 35 closes with, until the end comes, because it's still to come at the appointed times. In other words, all of these events are tied into a bigger plan. All of this stuff is tied into a bigger plan that God has. God's plan, and all this stuff's going to continue until that appointed time. And basically, until God says so. All of this is to say is that these verses accurately reflect certain aspects of the Maccabean revolt, and you can see that actually in history coming alive here. The earlier part of the revolt did actually see kind of limited support. And it is true that some people did join for personal gain or for some little notoriety instead of genuine faith. They weren't sincere. And the suffering that they experienced did, in fact, refine the character of the faithful. And the suffering did demonstrate their devotion to God. Now, the phrase end time is interpreted a lot of different ways. And some people see it as in the end of that specific persecution time that they were facing during that time of the Maccabean revolt. But a lot of people look at this as having a dual meaning. We've talked about this thing before called the law of double reference in prophetic scriptures. Meaning this points to the suffering then for the Maccabean revolt, but it's also pointing to the end times, which is an interesting segue into the last part of Daniel chapter 11. Because Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 through 35, primarily focus on historical events and conflicts. But Daniel 11, 36 to 45, these last 10 verses here shift to a more apocalyptic vision. describing a future king who will be godless and tyrannical. And we interpret that as the Antichrist. And you're going to see that shift as we get into this last part of chapter 11. So this section shifts to an more apocalyptic and symbolic language. Hello? There will be a future king that will exalt himself above all gods and will be successful, in a sense, until the time is completed. And this king, like I said, is interpreted as being the Antichrist. And the events described in this section are typically looked at as being future and being symbolic, pointing towards a time of great tribulation and of judgment. Let's get into it. Verse 36 says, "Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt himself and boast against every god, and will speak dreadful things against the God of gods. And he will be successful until the indignation is finished, because that which is determined will be done." So, keeping up with the same kind of study format here, the king will do as he pleases. He's going to be this unrestrained king that's going to act out his own will. He's going to act out what he desires. He'll have no regard for any other kind of higher authority at all. He's going to exalt himself and boast against every god. There's arrogance there. You can see a lot of arrogance in this person. He'll speak dreadful things against the God of gods. Notice the capital G. In other words, he's blasphemous, and he openly defiles and insults the one true God. But this also says he will be successful until the indignation is finished, because that which is determined will be done. In other words, his reign will appear to be successful for a time. But his power is ultimately limited by God's predetermined plan. Now, getting into the law of double reference here, this verse does seem to follow a loose description of Antiochus IV. A lot of people look at him, but a lot of scholars believe that this goes beyond him. And this is what we're going to see for the rest of the chapter, where it could be pointed at as Antiochus IV, or maybe some other historical leaders, but not to the same degree as the other scripture that we saw. The other scripture was to the point, and you can apply it right there. You know exactly what it was. The rest of this chapter is talking about the future Antichrist that we have yet to see. So, like I said, many scholars believe it goes beyond Antiochus IV, and it's actually seen as having dual fulfillment, the law of double reference. And some see it as pointing to the Antichrist of the end times, because the characteristics of arrogance and blasphemy and unrestrained power that are described in this verse and in the rest of this chapter, it might be common for tyrannical leaders throughout history, but there's a lot more evidence here pointing to the future Antichrist. And then at the end here, I'm going to throw some more scripture at you guys that'll really pull some things into a clearer picture here. Verse 37 says, "He'll show no disregard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will boast against them all." So first it says he'll show no regard for the gods of his fathers. So he's going to reject the religious traditions of his ancestors. So he's showing this complete disregard for established beliefs. He'll show no regard for the desire of women. Now that part's interesting there. And it's actually been interpreted a couple different ways. So some think that it could be talking about rejection of traditional family values or traditional family organization, the nuclear family, rejecting that. Maybe the rejection of wanting children at all. He doesn't want offspring. Could be talking about his disregard for the normal desires and affections for women. Maybe it's going down that road. In other words, rejection of traditional marriage and traditional family structures, rejection of the nuclear family. But some think it could be talking about the rejection of worship of female deities, a rejection of specific deities that were associated with women. So that part of the verse is still kind of open for interpretation, but it's worth mentioning that if you look at today, the nuclear family has been under attack for a long time. But that verse also says he'll show no regard for any other god, for he will boast against them all. Again, arrogance and self-exaltation. And this ruler is completely self-centered, and he's lacking any kind of semblance of traditional moral or religious values or implications. Now this verse, just like the previous one, is often interpreted as having that dual meaning. A lot of people try to apply it to Antiochus IV, but it's pointing to this future end times ruler, the Antichrist. Verse 38 says, instead, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, precious stones, and treasures. So he'll honor a God of fortresses. In other words, he's going to prioritize military power and military strength, essentially worshiping this deity that's associated with warfare and fortress and strength and military power. Now, this could symbolize this absolute reliance on military strength and technology as kind of the ultimate source for their security and authority there. But it mentions it as a God whom his fathers did not know, which means it's a God that's distinct from traditional deities and traditional religious traditions that his ancestors had. It shows this radical departure from traditional religious practices. Some sort of innovative and unconventional approach to power and to worship, which is really interesting. It says he'll honor him with gold, silver, and precious stones and treasures. It's talking about this maybe new form of worship that's showing this extravagant devotion to this new militaristic God. And it will be this display of wealth and precious objects that will indicate his willingness to invest into his military, into this new form of worship. Now, this verse can be seen as this picture of a ruler that puts his trust solely in his military strength and into material wealth as well. Again, just like the previous verses, dual fulfillment. Because again, a lot of people apply it to Antiochus IV. But again, it seems to be pointing to this end times ruler here. So let's keep looking a little bit closer here. Verses 39 and 40 says he will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him and will make rulers over the many and will parcel out land for a price. And at the end time, the king of the south will wage war with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships, and he will encounter countries, overflow them, and pass through. So he's going to take action against the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. So just on its face right there, this verse is describing his military strategy, essentially. He's using a foreign god, some sort of foreign power or foreign ideology to secure strongholds and to fight against other people. And it could symbolize this reliance on foreign alliances or ideologies to maintain his power. He'll give great honor to those who acknowledge him and will make them rulers over many and will parcel out land for a price. In other words, he's going to reward his supporters with positions of authority and give them land, help them with their own personal gain. And it shows that he's going to use those that follow his ideology to secure his military strong points and military strongholds. But then that second part, verse 40, it marks the beginning of this ruler's downfall. It says there's attacks from the king of the south and attacks from the king of the north. And at the end time, the king of the south will wage war with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. The end time is talking about this period of final conflict here. During that time, the king of the north is going to launch this massive, overwhelming attack, and it describes it like a storm using chariots and horsemen and ships. But it says he'll enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. In other words, he's going to invade and conquer many lands. And these verses are describing, again, the beginning of the end for this ruler, with kind of dual attacks coming at him. Needless to say, what this is describing is this really intense conflict here in military aggression, this war. Verse 40 describes a kind of dramatic and sudden attack on him. And it seems to point to the ruler's vulnerability, even though he seems to be so powerful nobody can stand against him. And yet he does seem to have this vulnerability. And again, a lot of people look at this as having dual meaning, because you can apply this event or these verses to events that happened during the time of Antiochus. But they also have implications for end-time prophecy. Again, the law of double reference. The phrase end time is typically a phrase that's related to the end times. In verses 41 to 45, he will enter the beautiful land, notice the capital letters, and many countries will fall. But these will be rescued out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. And they will reach out with his hand, or then he will reach out with his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, over all the precious things of Egypt, and Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. But rumors from the east and from the north will terrify him, and he will go out with great wrath to eliminate and annihilate many. And he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, and yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. So first it says he will enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall. Beautiful land is Israel. And it's describing this ruler's invasion of Israel and his conquest against these many countries. But certain regions are going to escape his control, highlighting that he's not this all-powerful, all-consuming person. Edom, Moab, and Ammon are all going to escape. But it says he will reach out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. Basically, he's going to attack other countries, including Egypt. He'll gain control over hidden treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. And Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. He's going to take control over the wealth and resources of Egypt. And the Libyans and Ethiopians are going to submit to him. But then rumors from the east and from the north will terrify him, and he'll go out with great wrath to eliminate and annihilate many. So he's going to hear these rumors, and they're really going to bug him. He's going to be bothered by these rumors from the east and the north. So he's going to launch even more battles against even more people with this great wrath to eliminate and annihilate many. And he'll pitch tents of his royal pavilion between the seas of the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. This last verse is describing kind of this final stand in the beautiful holy mountain, talking about Jerusalem. But it says he will come to his end and no one will help him. He will ultimately meet his end, and there will be nobody there to save him. Now, the end of verse 45 saying nobody will help him shows the complete and total end of this ruler's power. And these last verses illustrate a period of really intense conflict and widespread destruction over the whole area. And this ruler is really aggressive, and he's really greedy, and he has this thirst for power. And just like the other 10 verses before, everybody thinks that this has double meaning here. It applies to verses prophesying about events during the time of Antiochus IV, but also having implications of end times prophecy and the Antichrist. So with these last verses in chapter 11 talking about the ruler's final campaigns here and his conquest of these other countries, it's eventually going to accumulate in his ultimate demise. And again, all of this emphasizes the limitations of human power versus the sovereignty of God. So in this chapter, before we get into kind of a deeper look at it here, just going back to last week, this has all been presented to Daniel from an angel. This angel begins referencing support that he gave to Darius the Mede, and then he outlines some Persian kings, and then he starts talking about this mighty king that has this empire that is going to be divided after his death to his 4 generals, and he's talking about Alexander the Great. And then the angel starts talking about these conflicts between the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt, the south, and the Seleucid kings of Syria, the north. And he's talking about wars and alliances and betrayals between these kingdoms. And then even having specific details that, like I said, they perfectly match up with historical events. And then today we continued along those lines, mostly focusing on Antiochus, who was the Seleucid king that was known for his persecution of the Jewish people and his desecration of the temple in Jerusalem. And then these last 10 verses here, they shift to this description of this powerful, really arrogant king who thinks of himself as being above every other god. And he disregards traditional deities, he disregards traditional religious beliefs and morals, and he honors this God of fortresses and military power, and he persecutes anybody that's remaining faithful to God. And then he's going to engage in these military campaigns and conflicts with the king of the north and the king of the south, and eventually he's going to meet his end. So again, Daniel 11 verses 36 to 45 is interpreted as a prophecy that's describing the Antichrist that's yet to come. This ruler that is powerful. It's a godless king that exalts himself above all gods. And he speaks against the God of gods, and he persecutes Israel. And all of that aligns with other prophecies about this future evil ruler. So let's look at it deeper. Verse 36 says, he's a king that will do as he pleases and will exalt himself and boast against every other god. He's portrayed as this really arrogant, self-worshiping guy that when you look at it, it seems like he's exceeding previous rulers in terms of his wickedness. And not only that, it says he's going to speak dreadful things against the God of gods. He's going to show no regard for the gods of his fathers. He's going to have no regard for the desire of women. He's going to have no regard for any other god. He's going to boast against them all. And instead, he's going to honor this God of fortresses. And again, all of this aligns with prophecies about this future ruler. And the passage closes with the king's actions in the end time, where he will eventually come against Israel, and many nations are going to be overthrown, but he's eventually going to come to his end, and no one will help him. Now, it's worth mentioning that the description of this ruler, like I said, it aligns with prophecies about the Antichrist. And there's parallels found in the New Testament in 2 Thessalonians and in Revelation. So the king in Daniel 11:36 that will do as he pleases and exalt himself and boast against every god, it resembles the man of lawlessness that's described in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, who exalts himself above every so-called god or object of worship. So 2 Thessalonians 2 says, no one is to deceive you in any way, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first. And the man of lawlessness is revealed, and the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called god or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Then Daniel, the whole last part of it, describes this ruler that's going to go out with great wrath and eliminate and annihilate many, and will pitch tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. This aligns with the beast from the sea, described in Revelation 13, that makes war against the saints and overcomes them. So look at Revelation 13, verses 5 and 6. It says, a mouth was given to him, speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. And he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, and to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. We're going to look at some more scripture in 13 in a second, but it's describing this beast speaking arrogant words and blasphemies against God, which is consistent with Daniel 11:36, portraying this ruler that's going to exalt himself and boast against every god and speak dreadful things against the God of gods. Then verse 7 in Revelation 13 says, it was also given him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given to him over every tribe, people, language, and nation. Again, directly corresponding to Daniel 11's depiction of this ruler that's going to go out with great wrath and eliminate and annihilate many. Not to mention the concept of the beast in Revelation 13 having authority over the earth and people worshiping it, that also aligns with the ruler that's described in Daniel 11 that exalts himself. The king in Daniel 11 will speak dreadful things against the God of gods, and he'll be successful until the indignation is finished. That's really close to what we see in Revelation, mirroring the false prophet that's performing signs and deceives people. Look at Revelation 13, verses 12 to 14. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and he makes the earth and those who live on it worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down out of the sky to the earth in the presence of people. And he deceives those who live on earth because of the signs which it was given him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who live on the earth to make an image of the beast who had a wound of the sword and has come to life. And then Revelation 16, verses 13 to 14 says, and I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs, for they are spirits of demons performing signs, which they go out to the kings of the entire world to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. This king in Daniel 11, verse 45, says that he's going to come to his end and no one will help him, talking about this final defeat that he's going to experience, which is consistent with the Antichrist's ultimate destruction that's described in Revelation 19, verse 20. It says, "And the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone." This verse is depicting the decisive capture and destruction of the beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet, signifying their end in a definitive and irreversible way. The image of them being thrown into the lake of fire is implying absolute abandonment and judgment on them. No one is there to help them. No one is there to rescue them, fulfilling the "no one will help them" aspect of Daniel 11:45. The lake of fire symbolizes their complete and final annihilation. And additionally, the entire context of Revelation 19 describes the return of Christ and the defeat of Christ's enemies, and it's reinforcing the idea of this final defeat of the Antichrist. And Daniel 11, verses 36 to 45, leads into Daniel 12:1, which we're going to read next week. But it's talking about this time of distress, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time, which is a time of great tribulation and persecution, which is aligned with the great tribulation that's mentioned in Matthew 24, verse 21, the period of intense suffering but before the return of Christ. If you look at Matthew 24:21, it says, "There will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor will ever again." All of this being said, despite the complex political struggles of both the past and the future, Daniel 11 is emphasizing that God is ultimately in control of history, and God is ultimately in control of the future. God gets the victory. And all the detailed descriptions of these historical events are absolute proof of the Bible's prophetic accuracy, which means for us that we can trust the things that are yet to come just as they're described. If we can look at this and see it applied to history to the T, all the stuff that's yet to come is going to come the way that it's described in here. This chapter is pointing towards a final period of tribulation, but the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. So like I said in the very beginning of this, Daniel chapter 11 is a challenging chapter to interpret because of the intricate details and symbolic language, but it provides a powerful reminder of God's sovereignty over history and future and his faithfulness to his people. And next week is our last week of Daniel. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, first of all, your word is amazing, and I just want to thank you for using Daniel mightily, God, and recording your word and recording your prophetic words, God, so that we can study it and we can see that your word is true, God, that prophecy in this book comes true, and it comes true perfectly, God. And that means we get to trust what this book says, God. We get to trust that your will be done. We get to trust that when you say that you came to save this world, God, we can trust that. When you say that you gave your only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life, we get to cling to that and know that it's true. So God, I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for your faithfulness, God, in your word. And I want to thank you for our opportunity to be able to study it, God, and be able to decipher it, and be able to see it come alive. So God, I ask that you just continue to bless our time together, God. Continue to bless our little church, God, and continue to speak to us, God, and use us mightily. And God, ultimately, we love you and we trust you, God. We know that your word is true. It's coming true, and it's going to continue to come true. And we trust you, God. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.